Yes, yes. Let's all just take a deep breath in and we release. Well, good morning, Celebration Spiritual Center. How are we? How are you feeling? How are you being? How are you doing? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I want to say, and I was remiss to say it last week, Happy Pride Month. It's June. Yes, yes. I also just want to reiterate that the mental health first aid training is on July 7th, and the seats are filling up. As all of us have felt a lot and had a lot of thoughts around the transition of Kate Spade and the transition of Anthony Bourdain. If you want to be of service, if you want to make a difference, this mental health first aid training is the way that you do it. So that someone close to you, you may recognize the symptoms, you may be able to support them in getting the support that they need. This is the other side of it. There's an awareness part, but then there's an inspired action part. And this is what we get to do if we're here. As I posted the other day, or on Friday, that I think these are the canaries in the mines. And so as we have celebrities, well-known folks that we're seeing dealing with challenges just like all of us are, then we have the opportunity to use that to then say, how can I be of service to my direct community? This is a way that you can do that. So I encourage you all to please sign up. So we are in our series, The Gnostic Gospels, Reimagine the Bible, The Gnostic Gospels. And last week we started with, There is Nothing Hidden from You, focusing on and inspired by the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel that we now realize through research is actually the earliest gospel we have, even older than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it gives us a very different picture. And what I talked about in looking at how the Nag Hammadi Library came into being, or was discovered in the 1940s, it's a reflection of this idea that nothing can ever be hidden, right? And so often we had the idea that there were books of the Bible that were burned, and it's true, but they were actually, not available, but they were hidden, and the earth brought them into being when we as humanity were ready. And so we looked at a verse there in Scripture where Jesus says, know what is in front of your face, and then what is hidden from you will be disclosed. And so then we talked about life being a mirror, and that if you want to understand what's really going on in your own mind and your subconscious thoughts, look at what's happening in your life. It's the mirror, and it's showing us what's disclosed. I invite you to go back to that message. It's on YouTube. Now, one of the other things I talked about in the history of the Gnostic Gospels and the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library is that before the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in the 1940s, we first had the Gospel of Mary, which actually was discovered in 1896. And that was actually the Greek copy or version of the Gospel of Mary. And then later, in the 1940s, the Gospel of Mary, or Mary Magdalene, was also there in the Nag Hammadi Library. This was the Coptic or Kemetic or Egyptian text. And so it's interesting because just the presence of this gospel changes things, right? We had all of these male-oriented gospels written in the name of these men. The men didn't write them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what we recognize, what's done in that world and at that time, you wrote in the name of a teacher, right, that was honored or revered. You wrote in their spirit. And so that's why they were named after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So if we have a gospel that's now named after Mary Magdalene, it's a beautiful thing because we recognize that the community that felt this scripture was worthy enough to be compiled, it means that they ascribe to these larger ideas of who Mary Magdalene is or was. And it's interesting to me because also we get a very different picture about early Christianity, if you will, by looking at this text. Now, there's some interesting things in terms of wording. So often we hear Jesus referred to as the Son of Man. But in the Gospel of Mary, Jesus is referred to as the child of humanity. Interesting, inclusive language, way back in ancient times. And then not only that, but then the child of humanity, that name is then also ascribed to each and every one of us. That actually the goal in life is to come to this awareness that we are the child of humanity, right? The idea of the Son of Man or child of humanity is this idea of understanding that we are one with God, having that consciousness of being absolutely united with God or with the source. Another thing that we find in this text, God, the word God is never used. The term that is used is the good. Sounds like a New Thought text to me. Now, something even more controversial, which I love, is that we have this wonderful moment in the text where Jesus says, the disciples are asking him questions. And they ask him to tell them about the nature of sin. Jesus' reply is, there's no such thing as sin. Sounds like A Course in Miracles. And it's very interesting because if you read this text and if you've read or studied A Course in Miracles, this is the same Jesus. That same voice of Jesus that we hear in A Course in Miracles, we hear it in this text. And so what's happening in this text? Where we are is, this is after the resurrection. And if you're familiar with the stories, after the story of the resurrection, then Jesus, depending on which gospel you read, Jesus appears to the disciples or appears to certain people in various ways and in various forms, right? And so here's where we are in this scene. It's after the resurrection, and he's hanging out with the disciples, and they're asking him a lot of questions. Because he's now in this resurrected state, right? He's in this even more marvelous place of understanding and knowing than he was even before the resurrection. And so they're asking him a lot of questions, and he answers the questions, and then he leaves. And so he leaves and gives that kind of familiar idea of go into all the world and preach the good news, preach the gospel. And so then the disciples are really sad. They're sad and they're scared and distraught because they're like, what are we going to do? Like, Jesus is gone now. Like, it's all on us. What are we going to do? And so in that place of feeling distraught, they said, well, Mary, we know that you were the beloved disciple. And we know that Jesus, because you were the beloved disciple, Jesus shared things with you, secret teachings that he didn't share with us. Can you tell us some of those things? Because maybe that'll help us feel better. And she began to share some of these secret teachings, which are things that they had never heard before. And these men didn't like what they heard. Andrew called them strange teachings, and Peter got mad and said, there's no way that Jesus taught you all that. You're a woman. Why would you be given some secret knowledge, and why would you be given all of this truth, and we weren't as men? Now, it's interesting because this text, some scholars believe that this is then giving us a picture of the tensions in early Christianity. I don't think that's what was going on, but that's one point of view. But what's interesting is after that, Peter, who was the hot-headed one, Levi shows up and begins to defend her and says, Peter, you're hot-headed, you're becoming like everybody else. You're creating division, you're creating separation, right? And he affirms Mary Magdalene and affirms this truth that she had been sharing. So I want to take our attention to one of the verses. It's actually part of the conversation with Jesus, something that Jesus shares and says. And this is going to support us in our conversation today. So Jesus says, matter gave birth to a passion that has no image because it derives from what is contrary to nature. A disturbing confusion then occurred in the whole body. That is why I told you, become content at heart while also remaining discontent. Indeed, become contented only in the presence of every true image of nature. Whoever has ears to hear should hear. And I want to read this line again. Become content at heart while also remaining discontent. Indeed, become contented only in the presence of every true image of nature. Whoever has ears to hear should hear. Be content while also remaining discontent. I am so grateful and thankful for this verse because I began to think about this past week and all that is taking place in the news. I already mentioned the transition of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. I began to think about the images that we're seeing of children being snatched from the arms of their mother and essentially being held in cages in the name of the United States of America, this place that we are citizens of. Even as we think about and hear about suicide of two well-known folks, the statistics tell us that 123 people a day commit suicide in this country. It is the 10th leading cause of death in this country. It's one of the top 10. We, of course, can look to other things that are happening in our country, that people of color are still being brutalized by the police force, are still being killed unarmed by the police force here in Brooklyn and Sacramento recently. I shared a video, it was pretty disturbing for me. I shared it on Facebook yesterday of an orangutan defending its home, a tree, which is its home, from a bulldozer that is knocking down trees, deforestation. And this orangutan, you can see it's distraught, and it's trying to push against the bulldozer to save its home. And one of the things I said in the post there was that, this also reflects man's inhumanity to man, because we do the same thing with forced evictions. Corporations or the government in some cases decide they want to build something somewhere, and then they just force you out of your home. There's a lot of things that have us in discontent. Yes, yes? And yet we hear Jesus saying to us that we can be content while also remaining discontent. So the question becomes, how do we do this? And I have three things. First, you have to know your function. Second, you have to know that your function is forgiveness. And then finally, we take action. So it's interesting to me because, as I said, the Jesus that we find in the Gospel of Mary really reflects the same voice of Jesus that we see in A Course in Miracles. And so if we go to A Course in Miracles and we go to the workbook lessons, under the heading, What is the World?, we find something very similar. In the Course we read, let us not rest content until the world has joined our changed perception. Let us not be satisfied until forgiveness has been made complete, and let us not attempt to change our function. We must save the world, for we who made it must behold it through the eyes of Christ, that what was made to die be restored to everlasting life. Saying a similar thing, let us not rest content. Live or be discontented until the world has joined our changed perception. Now, what Jesus said earlier is this idea that the world, or the image that we made, is what's contrary to nature, what's contrary to absolutely what is true. And so we should only be content in the presence of the true image of nature. And so we're asked this question then, if we must know our function, what is our function? And one of the things I think that's beautiful is that if you look in A Course in Miracles, and I love that we have a digital version, your function appears 80 times in the text. Over and over, your function, your function, your function. It's always bringing us back to this idea of understanding what our function is. And one of the simplest ways that's described in the text in chapter 11, as your function in heaven is creation, so your function on earth is healing. Interesting. But instead of fulfilling our function, we're actually living in fear and sadness. Because as we're hearing what's going on in the news, as we're reading about what's happening to our brothers or sisters in this country or beyond, we move into a place of fear and dissatisfaction. And the chorus goes on and it says this is in chapter 4. God gave you a very lofty responsibility which you are not meeting. You know this and you are afraid. In fact, your ego has chosen to be afraid instead of meeting it. Now, what is this saying? Who or what is actually afraid or fearful or dismayed or begins to lose hope or wonder, how is this ever going to change, right? It's your ego. Because your ego wants you to be stuck in not doing anything. Your ego wants you to not recognize your function, which is healing, not recognize your function, which is forgiveness. We're going to get to that in a second. If you're in fear, if you're sad, if you're dismayed, and if you don't have hope, then you're frozen. You're stuck. You can't be the change that we're seeking in the world. You can't answer the call for love. You can't do that if you're in that place. Then we also read later in the text, this is in chapter 7, the Holy Spirit reminds you gently that you are sad because you are not fulfilling your function as co-creators with God and are therefore depriving yourselves of joy. So we got to know our function. I get it. I understand. I just talked about a few things that are happening in this planet. But when we start to bring our attention on it, we start to feel small. We start to feel helpless. We start to think there's no way that I could make any impact on the world. There's no way that I could make any impact on police violence. There's no way that I could make impact on sexual violence. There's no way that I could make an impact on climate change. There's no way that I could make impact on what's happening with immigration. That's exactly where the ego wants you. Because in that place, you have forgotten who you are. In that place, we have forgotten our function. And so then we understand that forgiveness is our function. But what do I mean when I talk about forgiveness in this context? Because, we talk about forgiveness a lot and self-forgiveness and forgiving your brother. But what we're talking about here is letting go of the false perception of this world. A Course in Miracles begins very simply. It's the summation of the entire course, and I'm sure many or most of you know it. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. So the first thing in this idea of forgiveness is we must forgive ourselves for this perception that we thought that all of this dismay, all of these things that are happening in the world are real. And then at the same time, we must forgive ourselves from this perspective of thinking that we are too small or do not have the capability or capacity to make any impact on the world because we are the light of the world. And we say it all the time, but the Course is clear. Every act of fear is a call for love. So we have to forgive ourselves for not picking up the phone. We have to forgive ourselves for not seeing the news headlines as a call for love. We have to forgive ourselves for not seeing the ways that separation is being, is just happening all throughout this country, and division is happening, and disunity, not seeing that as, oh, this is a call for love. This is a call for me to show up. This is a call for my light. This is a call for my love. And when we think about it, I had this sort of image. I hope this is helpful for you. When we think about this idea of forgiveness as our function and needing to forgive ourselves, imagine if someone had been writing their entire life with a pencil. And they're writing and writing, just like we live life, right? You're living life day to day, creating, co-creating. They're writing, just page after page, nonstop, just like we're living, nonstop. And of course, just as in our life as we're living, as that person is writing, they make a mistake. They make an error. But what they were never told is that there's an eraser on the other end. And so they just kept writing and writing because, I made this mistake. Well, I got to keep going. Some people knew that there was an eraser there, but they weren't told what the eraser does or how it functions. And so they just kept writing and writing, making mistakes, but writing and writing and writing. But what's beautiful is forgiveness is the understanding that there's the presence of an eraser. And so as we say, nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal exists, herein lies the peace of God, then we recognize that we have the power, possibility, and capability through this superpower of forgiveness to turn the pencil over and erase. But here's what's interesting, because even some of us, we Somebody told us about the eraser. We know we have the eraser, but what do? We've spent years beating ourselves up for all the years that we didn't erase. Or instead of learning how to use the eraser for ourselves effectively, we want to go out and tell everybody else, you know you got an eraser. You know you can erase that, right? And so when we're talking about letting go of our false perception of the world, you know, it's a crude analogy, but it's an analogy, right? I hope it helps you in some ways to think about it. That you have this possibility through changing your mind and changing the meaning that you've assigned to an event. Things that are horrific, things that don't feel good, yes. But then when we're able to assign the meaning that it is a call for love, it's like turning the pencil over and erasing, because now through bringing our love, not love in the sense of, oh, I'm just loving everybody. That's not what we're talking about. That's why we're going to get to number 3, take action. But when we get to this place of love and recognizing that it's a call for love and a call for our light to be the light of the world, then we literally change what's on the page. We literally begin to change what's happening in life. Know your function. Forgiveness is your function. And then finally, take action. And when I thought about this step of take action, it took me to one of my favorite people, Henry David Thoreau. In his classic text, Walden, there's an essay on civil disobedience. I always remember in high school just being fascinated by the fact that there was this essay on civil disobedience, and we were being allowed to read it in school. Like, it was cool. And so there's a couple things that Thoreau says in this essay. I invite you to read it, because it's even interesting in the context of where we are now, because the things that he was writing about in thinking about civil disobedience, he was writing about the fact that he was living in a country that held slaves. And it was like, how can this be okay? At the time, he was living in a country where there was the war that was happening in the West, what was then present-day Mexico. And he was like, we're taking people's land. This doesn't make sense. And then what about the Native Americans? He was writing about all of those things at that time. And it's interesting when we consider the energy around what's happening today, because it just fits. It just fits. But he writes these words. He says, let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step towards obtaining it. And then he also says that as we take action, we have to take action from principle. So what does this mean if we're talking about take action? It means that action requires an inner knowing and also an inner stillness. Because when he says, let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step towards obtaining it, what he's talking about is we have to have a vision for the world that we want to see. And we got to go back to it. When the ego has us in fear and sadness and dismay and frozen and locked into I don't know what I can do, that means then we're also not able to access a vision for a future. What's beautiful about life is good and it's contrast. And the contrast is giving us the perspective for what it is that we want. It's giving birth to that. And y'all know this, we talk about it all the time. Okay, this is what I don't want. Now what do I want? And so what Thoreau is offering to us is that first we have to just make known first to ourselves, what is it? What type of world do we want? What type of government do we want? What type of police force do we want? What type of immigration system do we want? What type of environmental policies do we want? What type of interactions between men and women do we want? What type of interactions do we want in our workplace? What are the things that we want? But again, if we're just living in fear, we cannot access the highest, grandest, greatest reality. And so if you don't know what you want and you're feeling that, we go back to the prayer from the song, show me. Show me clearly. I realize that from this vantage point, I can't see it all, but I'm connected to this mothership that's looking down and can see everything. So show me. what is it that I really want? Because I'm not feeling good, so I know this is something that's different than what should be. We go back again to the words of Jesus where we have, he says, become content at heart while also remaining discontent. Indeed, become content only in the presence of every true image of nature. And so the reason why we're feeling the discontent, because the true image of nature is not being revealed on the planet. It's the only reason we don't feel good, because it's opposite of what Source is desiring to birth in, through, and as us, right? And so if we're feeling this discontent, then the question is, what is the world that we want? And so the action creates inner knowing, or requires inner knowing, and the action requires an inner stillness. And this is the piece that I love, this inner stillness. Be content while also remaining discontent. There's a way that we can operate in the world as powerful metaphysicians that you are. That there's an inner stillness and there's an inner knowing while you're moving through inspired action. And that's required. Why? Because we recognize that change, there's a process of change. There's a process of something coming into being. We talked a little bit about that last month, on an individual level of crossing the river of change and how that happens. But we recognize that it's the same thing even on a collective level. And so if you're the type of person that think you're going to go out and march for our lives with the children, on Saturday, and then think that all the policies are going to be changed by Monday, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. So we recognize that then there has to be this inner contentedness, that I'm already connected with what is true, that I'm already connected with the good that is. This is why meditation is so important. As Dr. Joe Dispenza says, meditation, one of the meanings of it is to get familiar with. And so we move into that place of stillness on a daily basis, or 20 minutes twice a day if you're a TMer, so that you can get familiar with this thing that we are connected to, that lives within us. And what's so beautiful, and after the verse that we just shared about being content while remaining discontent, Jesus makes it very clear. Because he says all of those words, and then he's getting ready to leave, and then he says this. When the Blessed One has said these things, he doesn't say this, this is the story. When the Blessed One had said these things, he greeted them all and said, "Peace be with you." But then he goes on, "Acquire my peace within yourselves." And then he goes on, this instruction is so important. "Be on your guard so that no one deceives you by saying, 'Look over here,' or 'Look over there.' For the child of humanity exists within you. Follow it. Those who search for it will find it." It's clear. That this contentedness, and even if we look into some of the translations, this idea of be content while also remaining discontent, we can hear in other translations, and it's alluded to in other gospels, be at peace. And so this is why he says, "Peace be with you." But he goes on, "Acquire my peace," or this peace, "within yourselves." And the only way that we can actually create change, the only way that we can create a world that works for everyone, the only way that we can create the world that we want to see, the world that feels good, the world that when we watched, I don't know if you all have seen it, please go see it on Netflix last night, the Bobby Kennedy documentary, Bobby for President. There's a world that was going to be created, that was being birthed as a result, not just of him, but the contrast that was happening in the world in 1968. And I know that that world exists. I know that that world is still possible. And whatever the reasons were, or the people, or the conspiracies, or whatever happened that contributed to his assassination, and Martin Luther King's assassination, and Malcolm X's assassination, and Medgar Evers' assassination, whatever that was, that's not the true image of nature. And so I think even on a collective level, as we talk about this forgiveness, we have to forgive ourselves collectively for the thought that believes that anytime somebody speaks truth, they get killed. If we think about it, there was something within humanity collectively that believes that. Even before Obama was elected, Wyclef wrote the song, "If I was president, I'd be assassinated by the end of the week. Y'all know that song where he talks about it, right? So there was even, this fear about the first black president would be killed immediately. And so we have this deep-seated belief within ourselves that the voice of peace has to be killed, that the voice of reconciliation, the voice of unity is always destroyed. Can we forgive that thought? Because when we forgive it, then we change our minds. And when you change your mind, then the world you see begins to picture it differently. Two last things. The other part, when we're thinking about taking action, I was reminded of something that's in one of the letters of Paul in 1 Thessalonians. At the end of one of these verses, it says, abstain from evil. And for me, growing up in the Pentecostal church, that meant, you're not supposed to sin. Pentecostal church, you couldn't smoke, drink. In some cases, women couldn't wear earrings or makeup. Right? All of that was considered evil, right? It's just absurd. But I began to hear this verse differently, right? Because this idea of abstaining from evil, as we understand, and we can't get into all of the roots of the words and everything, but this idea of evil, the form of evil, really has to do with this idea of what we're talking about, that's not the true image of nature. Anything that is unlike the good is the unwanted thing. And so we can abstain from every form of this unwanted thing. So that means that in taking action, we have the opportunity now to not vote with our presence, vote physically if it's about voting, or even aligning ourselves with certain conversations. Right? Because one of the ways that we can take action on the simplest way, convenient way, is when we hear or see conversations that are not loving, say something, right? When things are going on in the workplace and it ain't right, and many times it ain't been right for a long time, and, that's just how the boss is, or that's just how this person is. Say something. Abstain from every form of evil. In other words, don't even participate. I love that idea, if people are voting, some people abstain. I'm not even participating in that. This is one of the ways that we can begin to take action, because what I understand and I know to be true right now, this is not a time for silence. This is not a time to be quiet. If there ever was a time, I don't think there ever was a time, and Thoreau is really admonishing us in the same way and on civil disobedience. Now, you make the choice that feels good for you personally, but make sure that it's from that contented place first. Make sure you're connected before you go out and protest. Make sure you're connected before you create that sign. Make sure you're connected before you have that conversation with someone. Make sure you're connected. Because I recognize that when you know and when you are connected, then love, God is speaking through you. And the right words will come forward. The right protest chant will come through. Because it'll be in this vibration. So again, how do we make use of our discontent? We know our function. We operate from our function, which is healing and forgiveness. And then we take action. In chapter 13 of A Course in Miracles, we read these words: fail not in your function of loving in a loveless place, made out of darkness and deceit, for thus are darkness and deceit undone. This is how we undo the world that doesn't have us feeling good. But this is a command. It's not just a cute little phrase. Fail not in your function of loving in a loveless place. When we talk about being the light of the world, that's what it is. Turning on your light in a dark place where we all know how wonderful it is. You ever sat in the dark before and didn't know where the light switch was? And then when the light switch was on, didn't everything change and you felt, oh, wow, now I can find what I'm looking for? That's what you get to do, your very presence. Being love in a loveless place, being light in a dark place. That's your job. That's our job. That's our function. Fail not. Because when you do that, I love to say a little light overcomes a sea of darkness. When you do that, everything changes. Be the person that changes the vibration of a room when you walk in. Be the person that people change their foolish conversations when you come around. I encourage you in your study this week, and let's stand. There's a powerful lesson in A Course in Miracles that I think really supports this message. It's lesson 132. I loose the world from all I thought it was. If you have a copy of A Course in Miracles, I highly encourage you to look up that lesson, or you can go to the website and look it up, lesson 132, and meditate on the words that are in this lesson through the week. Can we affirm that right now? I loose the world from all I thought it was. I loose the world from all I thought it was. And I set it free. I loose the world from all I thought it was. I loose the world from all I thought it was. And I set myself free. I loose the world from all I thought it was. And I set my sister free. I loose the world from all I thought it was. And I set my brother free. To that we say amen. Ashe. And so it is. So it is. Thank you, God.